Welcome back to An Ape's Guide to Human Language. We've been reviewing how different body parts can give markers of primate evolution and how primates have been moving between different habitats, moving around their landscapes using different parts of their bodies in different ways, and what this means for the way that their social groups might be changing. And all of this is in service to the general question: how do humans do the things that we do with language? If we take the perspective of a curious ape who's looking on at humanity and wondering how it is we sent people to the moon, and we're planning to send some more. We're all apes, we share a lot of our DNA, so what is it that makes human communication so much more effective than others? In our last set of classes, we were looking at the overall morphology, the shape and structure of the eye across different primate clades. In this week's lecture, we're going to be looking a little bit at the morphology, the shape and structure of the head. Here we have a lovely anatomical diagram of a human skull. I'm going to introduce a few different features that we can look at if we want to compare the morphology, the shape and structure of skulls across different primate species. First, we have the brow ridge. This is the bony protrusion that sits just above the eye sockets. The second region is known as the zygomatic arch, which is just across here in your actual face. So the zygomatic arch, it might not seem like an arch when we look at it from the outside. It seems like the bony protuberance of your cheekbones. But if we were to take a rod and slowly lower it down, it would actually go behind this arch shape here. The final feature of the skull that we're going to look at to begin with is the mandible, the jaw. So this is the bony part that is independently mobile of the rest of your skull. You can see that there's a little socket joint at the top that allows the mandible to move independently of the rest of the head. So mandible is another word for jawbone. We have two important muscles here, the temporalis and the masseter. So the temporal muscle is the one that comes up like a giant fan across the side of the head, and it connects the mandible to the side of the skull, allowing it to open and close with some amount of strength. So the size and shape of the zygomatic arch might tell us something about the size and shape of that temporal muscle. The second muscle we're going to look at is the masseter, the masticator, the chewing muscle. And this is the one that connects from the mandible bone down here to the inside of the zygomatic arch. And this is the second muscle that allows the jaw to move with some degree of strength and control. So again, when we think about the shape and structure of the zygomaticus, the zygomatic arch, this will tell us perhaps something about the shape and structure of those muscles. So here we have two skulls with their temporalis and masseter muscles drawn on. If you'd like to pause the video and have a go at a structure function analysis, this is a great opportunity for you to see if you can apply what we've been learning about differences in structure and differences in function. In a structure function analysis, first of all, you can play spot the difference. Can you describe the differences that you can see in terms of what is bigger, what is smaller, what is higher up, what is lower down? Just plain language descriptions using the technical terms for the body parts. And once you have observed some differences, can you think about functional outcomes that those structural differences might produce? So I'll remind you of a couple of details that we've been paying attention to so far. One of the details is wherever we have a larger buildup of bone, it usually suggests that there are greater loads present. The second thing to think about is the size of the muscle relative to the rest of the skull. I'll give everyone a moment in case they want to pause the video. It's time to move on. Let's take a look at the relationship between muscles and bones. We've talked already about the zygomatic arch. This is a feature that you may have spotted as being different between the ape that is drawn on the left and the human that is drawn on the right. If we take a look at the shape and structure of the zygomatic arch relative to the shape and structure of the cranium, the giant bony bowl part of the head, what you can see here is that the ape's zygomatic arch is so large that it is visible from a top view. Now what that tells us is the muscle bundle running through underneath the zygomaticus is enormous. That tells us once again that the muscles that are connecting from the side of the head down to the jaw must be very, very powerful. There must be an activity that primate is doing that requires a lot more jaw force. When we look at the picture of the human under the diagram label zygomatic arch, we can see that the zygomatic arch is hidden underneath the swelling of the cranium. Another feature that we might want to look at is how prominent the brow ridge is. So it might not be very obvious, but the brow ridge is actually a very important strength point for the zygomaticus itself. So we can see those two bones as working in concert to support heavy loads. What we can see when we look at the morphology of the brow ridge on the ape is a much more prominent brow ridge, again suggesting that the functional role of the zygomaticus is very important. The zygomatic arch is carrying huge loads compared to the zygomatic arch of the human. The third difference that we haven't really talked about so far is the sheer size of the muscle bundle on the side of the head relative to the rest of the cranium. So we can already see, even very superficially, that the temporalis muscle on the human only goes partway up the skull. And if you're feeling exploratory, you can actually feel where your temporalis muscle ends by placing your fingertips against the skin on the side of your head and clenching your jaw. You'll feel the muscle underneath the skin clenching up, bunching as you put load into your jaw. And you can move your fingers up and down against the side of your head to identify that place where the temporalis muscle simply stops. So once again, this is another source of evidence that the shape and structure of the skull is telling us something about the loads that are being carried by the musculature of the jaw. A feature that isn't evident on the human skull that also contributes to this story is known as the sagittal crest. So when we look at the picture of the muscle bundle on the side of the ape's head, not only does it come all the way up the side of the head, but at the very, very top, there's a separate bony protuberance for it to attach to so that it can once again increase the loads that the muscle can generate. Before we move on, let's think about what kinds of activities you might need a lot of muscle mass around your jaw for. I know the main thing that I do with my jaw is eating. So clearly when we look at these two species, there must be something behaviorally about the kinds of foods that I have access to versus the kinds of foods that this ape has access to that allow me to grow much smaller muscles in my jaw department and much smaller bones to sustain those muscles. So I'm doing something different with my diet, and we can see evidence of that in the bones and structures of my skull. So we have here a small video about changes in the overall shape and structure of the skull.
Here's a human head. This is actually a cast of a human who lived in Europe in the Ice Ages. And you can see that just like people today, he has a small face, it's very vertical, and a very large brain and a very rounded skull. But if you look at, say, a baboon right over here, you can see the baboon has a very enormous snout that sticks way out from its face. It's a very small brain and a very low skull vault. The big things that changed in human evolution is that our faces shrank, our brains expanded, we tucked our faces underneath our brains, and of course we also became bipeds.
The skulls of modern humans are also very different from those of our closest relatives, the Neanderthals.
Neanderthal this is a cast of a Neanderthal. Lived about 60,000 years ago in France. And as you can see, he has a very large face. Now his face is still fairly vertical, but the face is voluminous. It's huge compared to a human face, much larger. And the face is also stuck forward really far relative to the brain case. And a very simple way of explaining that is that if you were to sort of stick your finger up your eyeball, right, through your eyeball into your head, your finger would, if it went through the eyeball, would go into the frontal lobe of your brain. But if you were to do that to this Neanderthal, which of course you can't, because fortunately his eyeball's gone, but your finger would come out in his brow ridge rather than in his frontal lobe, because the whole face is stuck further forward relative to the brain in the Neanderthal than the human.
These subtle differences in Neanderthal skull anatomy would have made it harder for them to stabilize their heads while running.
So when we run, the head wants to pitch forward, and that's because the center of mass of the head is actually in front of the joint. So the joint is more or less here, around where your ear hole is. So his ear hole is there, and the center of mass of the skull is probably about here, right, right underneath where you begin to go gray on the side of your head. So that means that when you hit the ground, your head wants to pitch forward like that, and it can do so very rapidly. But our heads are pretty balanced, and we have interesting mechanisms to keep our heads still. A Neanderthal head, its joint is more or less in the same place as ours, so more or less opposite the ear hole. But because it has such an enormous face, its center of mass is about a centimeter or more forward than in the human being, which meant that the same force in a Neanderthal would cause its head to pitch forward with much greater force and much greater velocity. And so we think that Neanderthals would have had a slightly more difficult time, just like all other earlier humans, in stabilizing the head. They surely did it, but one of the traces that we can see that they had to work a little harder to stabilize their head is that the ligament here that attaches to the back of the skull is very robust in some Neanderthals and some early ancestors of humans. That nuchal ligament probably acts as a kind of spring that helps pull the head back and keep it stable.
So let's think about this locomotion hypothesis that we've just heard a little bit about from Dan Lieberman. He mentioned two details about the ways that primates might be moving around in their landscape and some structural evidence that we might have of that locomotion pattern. So he mentioned that the skulls of humans are very well balanced. So they sit very nicely on top of the high spine, meaning that they don't really fall forward as much and they don't really fall backwards as much compared to other primates. And we can see evidence of this when we look at the position of the foramen magnum. Now, foramen magnum simply means big hole in Latin. So if you turn a skull upside down and have a look in the bottom, there's always going to be a large exit point, which is where the spinal column comes out from the brain and runs down the back of the spine so that you can have nerve service to the rest of your body. In the skull of an ape, the foramen magnum is quite far towards the back of the skull, right? And this is an indication that the head of that primate is coming in on a spine that is typically oriented at an angle. That head is going to be very heavy and it's going to want to fall forwards. So in order to stop the head from falling forwards, we're going to need a very strong attachment point for the muscles of the spine and shoulders to hold onto. And that's what we see here in the nuchal area. The larger the nuchal area, which is the low flattish part at the back edge of a skull, the larger that nuchal area is, the thicker and stronger and more load bearing the muscles that attach there are. So we heard in the video that we just watched about the nuchal ligament. That's another sign of an important strength point. To take us back to our overview of the skull, what I should mention is we can see in profile the nuchal area here. It's just this low flat area at the very back of the skull. And the foramen magnum comes in almost in line with that ear hole. So it's very well balanced towards the center of mass of the skull. The other bones we haven't talked about yet are the jaw and the dental arcade. And once again, we can look for cues in the size and structure of the bone for what kind of job they have to do. So here we can see the jawbone of an ape next to the jawbone of a human, and we can see that the ape's large flat part at the side of their mandible is so much larger. It is clear that it is carrying more load compared to the human. So once again, there might be something about the core business of having a jaw that works out differently for these two species. On the right, we can also see some illustrations of the shape and structure of the dental arcade. So that's just the row of teeth. Here we can see the ape on the left and the human on the right have different shapes and also different structures. So we're going to zoom in a little bit more detail. But before we get started, the easiest bit for us to spot is that the ape's dental arcade has more of a squared off shape, while the human has much more of a rounded shape. So here's our zoomed in dental arcades and another opportunity for you to do a structure function analysis. If you want to pause the video at this point, you can. And you might like to think once again about what structural differences you can observe between the shapes of the dental arcades of these two primates. And then for every structural difference you observe, can you hypothesize about the functions that would be different? I'll give you a moment in case you want to pause the video. Time to move on. First of all, across the front of the dental arcade, we have the incisors, and incisors are very useful for cutting or cropping grass or leaves. They're not super sharp and they're not super strong, but they do have that cutting edge for tearing or chomping. Next, we have the two canines, and these are the fang teeth. Humans have the canine fang teeth as well. They're just very different in their shape and structure. The canines, because they can protrude at that angle, they're very good for tearing. So these are the teeth that you might see if an animal has some meats and they're trying to tear apart muscle tissues. But you may also see the canines in action when a primate is trying to get into a fruit with a very hard skin, like a durian or a rambutan, or other really tough foods like the husks of coconuts. Behind the canines, we have two sets of smaller, flatter teeth, the premolars and the molars. Now, both the premolars and the molars have a grinding job. So if you have a small grain and you want to turn it into nutritious food, the job that your molars can do is grind that grain backwards and forwards to extract the nutrients from the food. So we have three clearly differentiated roles for the teeth. We have incisors for cutting or stripping. We have canines for tearing or skewering hard surfaces. And then we have the premolars and the molars for grinding food. What we can tell from the shape and structure of the gorilla dental arcade on the left is that these three functions are discrete. They're handled separately by different teeth. What we see in the example of the human dental arcade is something quite different. All of the teeth are much more similar to one another. The human dental arcade clearly does not require all of those specialist functions to be so discrete. So, what can we learn from this? It seems, once again, like there's something different going on in the diets of humans compared to other primates. In fact, if we look at the evolutionary lineage to see what kinds of evidence we have for the emergence of these differences, we can in fact find in-between species that have a little bit more differentiation among their incisors and their molars, and a little bit more of a squared off dental arcade compared to a rounded one. And these are species that have existed in the prehistory of humans. We can also think about what kind of differences we can observe between members of the same species. On this slide, we can see a profile view of the canine teeth of an Australian human, a male and a female chimpanzee, and a male gorilla. So if you look just at the morphology of the canine tooth and the difference between the male and the female chimpanzee, we have another opportunity to do a structure function analysis. If you'd like to pause the video before we go on, I'll give you a moment to do so. And now we're ready to move on to what we can observe. So it's really important for us to think about what kinds of behaviours might differ between a male and a female chimpanzee. We can't put this down to food, because obviously nutrition is going to be very important for both male and female chimpanzees. So it doesn't necessarily serve an adaptive role for different members of the community to be eating different foods or surviving better if they have access to different foods. So the size of those canines differing between the female and the male is a sign of sexual dimorphism. That simply means the sexes have two different morphologies, two different shapes and structures. So chimpanzees live in groups where there is one dominant male who has breeding rights over the females in their community. Younger males don't have breeding access and might compete with each other to establish their position in the social hierarchy so that maybe one day they get to be the dominant male and have breeding rights to the other females. So in order to establish their social dominance, there are a lot of aggressive threat displays and some violent altercations. So what we can see here in the sexual dimorphism of the shape and size of the canines is not about who has the social role of protecting the social group from outsiders. What we see is who has the social role of establishing and maintaining dominance within the group. So one of the things we can think about when we apply this finding to humans is humans have absolutely no difference in the shape and structure of our teeth between male and female humans. So we might like to think, what does that mean for the kind of social organizations that we have and the kinds of breeding rights and mate selection that our communities prefer? Another way that we can look at differences across primate species in the morphology of the skull is to think back to what Dan Lieberman was mentioning earlier about how far forward the front of the face projects. So this is known as prognathism. So the projection of the lower face forwards below the eyes. We'll come back to that thought later as we progress. What we're going to do now is recap some of these anatomical highlights. The first feature that we can talk and think about in terms of how do primates differ is the size and structure of the zygomatic arch. We have a similar spectrum for jaw size. We can also look at a spectrum for the shape and structure of the dental arcade. So now we can ask ourselves a question. How could a primate manage to achieve these outcomes? Do they need to start walking so that when they become an upright primate, they can start reorganizing the balance of their skull on top of their spine? Or is it something as simple as maybe needing to eat different foods? Here's one lovely visualization of a human and a Neanderthal skull together. One of the things I like about this is we can see some of those features we heard about before from one of our nearest known relatives. We can immediately see that the Neanderthal has more of that forward-facing prognathism in their jaw. They also have a much heftier, much more robust zygomatic arch and a much more prominent and thicker brow ridge. So once again, this is telling us that although the Neanderthal has a dental arcade that is more similar to an anatomically modern human, the loads carried by the Neanderthal jaw are still much higher than by the anatomically modern human. There's one final anatomical detail that we can look at that is quite curious in differences between different human skulls. And this is the mystery of the human chin. So we have here a bunch of different primate mandibles, and as we survey them, if we just take a look at the morphology of the very tippy part at the very front of the mandible, and we look at where the tip of the mandible falls relative to the line of the teeth, what we see is something really interesting. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, are the only one that has a chin that projects out in line with or possibly even in front of the teeth. Neanderthals are very close to us in this regard, but the moment we get further away in the family tree, nobody but humans has a chin. So what's going on here? There are two main types of theories for what happened to the chin. The spandrel theories suggest that the chin has remained with us as an evolutionary accident, a left behind feature of some other change that was very important for our survival or our fitness or our ability to produce lots of babies that then survived and had lots of babies and therefore contributing to the evolutionary lineage. If there was some kind of adaptive change that accidentally gave us a chin and the chin wasn't a deficiency, then perhaps that's how we got our chins. The other class of theory is that the chin itself is adaptive. There's something about having a point that sticks forward close to or possibly even in front of the teeth that gets us something good. The first theory is that if humans were starting to move down the pathway to self-domestication by selecting mating partners who showed less aggression, the lower androgens, the lower sex hormones that can be associated with both jaw size and also with aggression may have resulted in reduction of the size of the mid-face, leaving behind the chin as a remnant. But we might ask ourselves, why would it only affect the middle part of the face and not the whole lower part of the snout? The second theory has to do with food, and again, it's a shrinking jaw hypothesis. So we might suppose that with softer food, we didn't need teeth that were as large, and as those teeth got smaller and smaller and smaller, they retreated, leaving behind a chin. But we can ask ourselves the same question, why didn't the chin also retreat? The third theory suggests that as we stood up as a walking primate and ended up with a very tall vocal tract and a lowered down larynx, the changes in the morphology of the airstream required an anchor point for that giant muscle bundle of the tongue to be held into. Now, what's interesting about this one is that it's not really clear whether a chin would help. We don't really have another model. Lots of primates have control over their vocalizations. Maybe not as refined as in humans, but it's hard to know whether it's just the chin that would be doing all of the work there. The second class of theories are the adaptive change theories. The first has to do with the idea that if androgens generate bigger chins in males in general, then perhaps the reason that we've been left with these big chins is because of sexual selection among females wanting to enhance the masculine characteristics of their breeding partners. But this doesn't seem to make much sense because men and women both have chins, and it's not like the little pointy bit at the front is radically different in its morphology for men versus women. The next theory is that if we have smaller teeth and a shorter jaw because of the reduction in prognathism, it changes the stresses on the jaw during chewing, and we need this chin to stick out there as the last remaining strength point, which is a little bit like the spandrel theory above. But once again, we're left with the same problem. We don't really know whether it's a particularly effective strength point because none of the other primates have it, and they require a lot more strength during chewing. The final adaptive change theory suggests that there might be something to do with speech and different stresses on the jaw that again require some kind of strength point to anchor either the muscles of the tongue or other articulatory gestures. And this one's really challenging for us because once we get into the domain of speech, we don't really have a comparison species. It's hard for us to go out and wonder whether we require it because we vocalize more or we require it because we vocalize differently when no other animal uses language quite the way that we do. There is one remaining hypothesis though, and this goes back to what we've been saying already. The idea that when we see a big bone, we should think immediately about loads, but we should think about the loads that are borne by muscles. So if we have a big bone, we should be thinking about what is the muscle that needs that bone to be large? And it turns out there is one muscle that attaches right down here on the chin, and this is the mentalis muscle. You can see it marked in red on the rotating skull, and it's not really required for chewing. It's not really required for preparing our food with our teeth, opening coconuts or anything dramatic, but it does have a role in social signaling. So this is the muscle where when you tense it, the bottom part of your chin changes its shape dramatically, and it's used around the world by human cultures as part of the way that they communicate. It looks like we may have a social explanation for chins. An explanation that isn't about survival in the sense of nutrition. It isn't about changes to our hormone characteristics or sexual dimorphism. It's about being better at communicating with each other using the bodies that we have developed. So here's a review slide for us to recap all of those technical terms. So now our primate has a new set of questions. Do I need a chin? Do I need a bigger group who I need to communicate with more effectively, and therefore do I need a chin? Do I need softer food? All of these changes might be possible pathways to take us down that road towards developing a language, something like what humans have. That's where we're going to leave it for today's mini lecture on skulls, and I'll see you back for more ape content soon.